Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and celebrate the fact that it has hit a new all-time high once again. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. So first things first, anytime Bitcoin hits a new all-time high or a new cycle high, it's reason to celebrate. And it further reinforces the point that we've been talking about for, I guess, the last 3 to 4 years, and that is that owning Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside, but it also minimizes your downside risk, right? And that's not to say that Bitcoin can't go down. In fact, last year we saw it go down many times, right? When we look at all these drops that Bitcoin had last year, so it's never the argument that it can't go down. It's just that the downside is going to be a lot more limited with Bitcoin than the rest of the cryptoverse. And that's why we spend so much time talking about Bitcoin dominance. And here you can see once again that Bitcoin is at a new all-time high, but how many other cryptocurrencies can say the same? This is not necessarily a dunk on other cryptocurrencies. It's just the way the cycle works, right? Like, this is the way the market cycle tends to behave. And, you know, if altcoins are going to catch a bid against Bitcoin, it's usually later on in the cycle. So right now, Bitcoin has just tagged 108,000, right, as I make this video. It has gone all the way up to 109.8 thousand, right? 109,833, at least according to the index here. So it's almost hit 110K. Now, when stuff like this happens, you know, of course, it's reason for celebration. And honestly, I mean, hopefully Bitcoin just goes higher, right? That would be the nicest thing. And hopefully we see that. It's also a good idea to just look at you know, if it does get a pullback, what would the expectations be? And so one of the things that we've mentioned before, and I will, at the risk of getting my face ripped off again in a few days, go through this exercise again. And basically, I'll show you an example where I was deterministic about the idea that I'm about to present and how it did not work out. And so just because things tend to work out doesn't mean they always do. So, for instance, if Bitcoin is, say, 70% of the time, let's say it's like red in September, if you go into every September thinking it's going to go down, every once in a while, right, Bitcoin will actually go up in September. And that actually happened, I believe, the last couple of Septembers. So probabilities, it's one of those things where it can happen most of the time, but it doesn't always have to happen. And one of the things that tends to happen, and this is something we've covered in length before, is that the market dumps before death crosses, so that on the other side of death crosses, the market then rallies, right? A lot of people panic sell down here, and they forget that the market historically rallies after a death cross. And you can see that this has turned out to be no different. All these prior death crosses had lows that formed around the time of the death cross. And so far, right, every single time, it led to a new cycle high, right? A new cycle high, a new cycle high, and sure enough, a new cycle high. After every death cross, it has marked a low and led to a new cycle high in this market cycle. Now, one of the things that I've previously said, and with mixed success, right? With mixed success, is that a lot of times golden crosses behave in sort of the opposite manner in the short term as death crosses, right? So with a death cross, normally Bitcoin dumps into it, right? And then rallies on the other side of it. A lot of times with golden crosses, it's the opposite. Now, that doesn't mean that that dump has to be sustained, right? I mean, there's a good chance it could dump and then just go to another all-time high, right? But a lot of times, and we're not even at the golden cross yet, it's probably going to be either on May 22nd or May 23rd. It's going to be dependent on the price action. I don't know exactly when it's going to be. I was looking at it earlier, and it very well could just be May 23rd. Depending on how high Bitcoin goes, I guess, between now and then, it's possible for it to happen on May 22nd. But by the 23rd at the latest, we should, in fact, have a golden cross. And again, a lot of times, but not always, you get dumps on the other side of golden crosses. And what I want to do is I want to just show you a few examples so that you can at least be prepared. All right. And I'm not going to be deterministic about this. You know, if we get a dump after the golden cross or around the time of the golden cross, then we'll talk about it. Right. We'll talk about, all right, well, now that it's happening, you know, how do you navigate that? But just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, last year we had, you know, a death cross and then a rally by Bitcoin. And then here was the golden cross. And then, you know, just shortly after the golden cross, we had about a 10% drop. Now, it did rally for about one more day after the golden cross, but then we did get about a 9 to 10% drop. And then, of course, the market continued on. If you go look at 2023, this is where I operated deterministically, and I got my face ripped off, basically. You know, we had like sort of a face-ripping rally, face-melting rally that left no room to, you know, for people looking to quote unquote buy the dip, right? We had a massive rally. We then had the golden cross, and there wasn't really much of a pullback to speak about. And so there's been a few things this market cycle I've been deterministic about. One of those things being Bitcoin dominance going up and Bitcoin being a much better play than altcoins. The other thing, Ethereum going home, right? That happened, right? We can check that off the list. Alt Bitcoin pairs bleeding, you know, is just a derivative basically of Bitcoin dominance. And a few other things, right? We also said that if Bitcoin holds above 74K, if it holds above the 2024 high on this drop, then there's a much higher likelihood that we could put in new all-time highs. If it goes below that level, then the likelihood is a lot lower that we would put in new all-time highs. So we stayed above it, and we, in fact, did put in new all-time highs. Again, nothing's ever a guarantee. There's just certain things I've been deterministic about. Some of them work out really well. And you know, when that happens, you can feel good about yourself. You can be like, look, I know it was silly to be deterministic because no one really knows where the market's going to go, but at least it worked out. There are other times where it doesn't work out. And 2023 was one of those times for me because in Q4 of 2023, we had this death cross, and then we had this golden cross. And on the golden cross, I said very deterministically, you know, that we would have a 10% drop at the very least, and probably more than that, because I didn't really think that Bitcoin would go higher than 35K in 2023. It ended up going up to 44K, so it overshot what my expectations were for the year. Just another example of do not put a cap on Bitcoin's price in that way, because a lot of times if you do, Bitcoin will eventually exceed it, you know. So, but I did say that, right? I did say that, and you can see that Bitcoin, it ripped up to 35K. That was where I thought it would get rejected from and then come back down, cool off for a few more months. And it didn't, right? We didn't really see that. So there's a lesson in there to learn from failures. And when, you know, I make mistakes, if you make mistakes, that, you know, it's not always fruitful to be deterministic about things because sometimes the market will just kind of leave you behind. But I do want people to sort of understand like why I said that in 2023. It wasn't, you know, just because I wanted to buy more Bitcoin. I mean, I actually bought plenty, especially throughout all these years. I mean, I bought plenty throughout the years. But the real reason was it was just sort of experience, right? Like looking at prior golden crosses, like right here, and even if you don't even measure it from that high, and just noticing that a lot of times you get a golden cross, you get about a 10 to 15% drop. Even here, before the actual pandemic crash, you still had about a 15% drop after the golden cross. Even here in 2019, you can see we had a golden cross, and then right behind the golden cross, we had about a 15% drop. So the reason why I said that in 2023 was mostly just because I was a sort of an artifact of what I had experienced, right? My prior experiences with golden crosses influenced me to think that with a golden cross, you get a correction. We had one, you know, we had a correction after the golden cross in 2019. We had one in 2020. We had also had one in 2021. By the way, we had also had one after a golden cross in 2015, and that was a much deeper correction, right? We had a golden cross right here, And right after that golden cross, it actually marked a high for Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin fell 50%. So you can get, and here's another golden cross, right? Here's another golden cross where then Bitcoin eventually just sold off massively. So my prior experiences with golden crosses with Bitcoin in 2023 had always told me that you rally up. By the time you get to the point where you get a golden cross, price action has already done very, very well. People tend to get euphoric. They start calling for crazier and crazier price predictions in the short term. And then what ends up happening is then Bitcoin gets a pullback, right? And it keeps those people in check. And it's just sort of a way of the market, sort of calming down for a little while. So, I'm not trying to be deterministic here. I'm just suggesting that if there is a pullback after this golden cross, it would be a fairly normal pullback, okay? And I don't know exactly how high Bitcoin's going to go before potentially that happens. If it just stops there at like 109.8, a 10% drop would get Bitcoin basically back to 100K, maybe a little bit lower. If it's a 15% drop, like some of those other golden crosses we've seen, it would put Bitcoin back at around that 50-day and 200-day moving average, probably around 95K. Okay, because right now they're at like 93K. But again, by the time that actually happens, if it does, those moving averages will be higher, and they could be at that point at closer to $95,000. So this is an important thing to consider. The other thing that I want, to just kind of remind people of is that we've talked about this idea before as well. That Bitcoin can go put in new highs. Sort of the window for it to do so is late May to early June. Right, late May to early June. And the reason why I said late May to early June was sort of looking at last year and seeing that we had a rally into late May and then another one in early June. The year before that, we ended up getting a rally. It was a little bit later, right? It was in June, and then it eventually fell back down. But the point is I am, in the sort of the back of my mind, like it's hard not to be somewhat deterministic about expectations in the third quarter of the year. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the last 2 years, during the third quarter of the year, Bitcoin fell below its bull market support band, right, during the third quarter of the year. Now, this time, we actually got the drop below it in Q1. And, the optimist would like me to just think that that's all we have to get and we can just go up from here. But the glass half empty approach would suggest, well, what happens if we still get sort of this de-risking process in the third quarter of the year? Remember, in 2023, Bitcoin put in new cycle highs, and it actually stayed there for a number of weeks, and then it still sold off in the third quarter. Okay, over here, we had a nice rally in May and June, and then we still sold off in the third quarter. So I would argue like this. This is what I would think as it relates to Bitcoin. In the short term, I don't want to try to limit it. I know that it obviously can go up. That's a good thing. If you've kept your crypto portfolios Bitcoin heavy, you want Bitcoin to go up, right? This is what you want. And not only are you watching Bitcoin go up, you're also watching Bitcoin dominance go up, right? Bitcoin dominance is now up for like how many days in a row? 8 days in a row now. So that's a good thing, right? Not only were you invested in Bitcoin, but you also are not really sacrificing a lot in the way of opportunity costs, because every dollar you have in an altcoin is a dollar that was not in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the only one that's really pushing new highs right now. The other ones are still well below their prior all-time highs for the most part. So if Bitcoin can continue to go up, then maybe the next level would be sort of tagging this trend line right here, a few $1,000s higher. But if it can't, and it just gets, if it fades with the arrival of the golden cross, then I think the expectation would be that it would go down, consolidate for a few days, and then come back up and try again. Kind of like what it did last year, right? Where it actually topped out on May 21st, right? That's today, right? It topped out on May 21st, got a pullback, but then it tried again in early June, And I think you could argue the reason Bitcoin sold off in June of last year was because the unemployment rate started to trend higher again, right? That was when the unemployment rate really started to move higher. So that's kind of what I'm thinking right now. I think that there is a high likelihood that there will be some de-risking in the third quarter of the year, sort of the July to September timeframe. That's what I think is the most likely outcome. If Bitcoin does get a pullback off of these new all-time highs within, say, like a week or so, I don't think yet that pullback would be reflective of concerns about what may or may not happen in the third quarter of the year. I think it would just be sort of your typical golden cross pullback. Okay, that's what I would say. So, in this case, if you do see a golden cross dump, right, if you get a golden cross dump, then you really would like to see it go no lower than 95K before trying again. It doesn't even have to go that low, right? You want to see it go no lower than that. If it does that, and then it comes back up, and it still struggles with this level, and then it starts to fade again, kind of like what it did like over here, right? Where it just wasn't able to really break out, kind of like what it did right there, where it wasn't really able to break out. If it fades again, and it still can't get past this level in any durable fashion, and it's like mid-June, then at that point, I would argue you're more likely to see a de-risking process where you just come back down, right? And you retest some of these levels again. We did it in 2023. We did it in 2024. The post-halving years have a way of throwing curveballs. So I know from experience that if you go into post-halving years thinking that it's going to do exactly what it did in the prior 2 years, you're usually going to get wrecked to some degree, right? But this is more of like an if-then statement, right? If we get a golden cross dump, and then we get sort of a rally after that, and then we still struggle to really durably break above 110, and it's mid-June, then you probably would see the market start to price in some of that Q3 weakness at that point. If Bitcoin can break above these current levels, then that Q3 weakness might just come back down to prior resistance, right? Maybe we turn prior resistance into support, okay? But that's kind of what I'm thinking, like, at the current time with regards to Bitcoin. And I cannot stress enough that I don't think you should base your investing strategy on, Bitcoin's potential golden cross dumps. For me, as sort of a long-term investor, this is a process, right? And if Bitcoin comes back down and then comes back up and still can't break out by Q3, then I would argue, all right, the writing's on the wall. It's likely going to come back down. But I think there's time, right? There's time. And you could wonder, like, well, what would the narrative be for a de-risking process in the third quarter of the year? Again, we're not there yet, right? We're still in May. And I don't really think the market would even look towards that de-risking until about mid to late June, okay? What would cause it? I think one of the things that could cause it, a couple of things, right? But one of the things is, could just simply be the rising long end of the yield curve, right? The long end of the yield curve, the 10-year yield is now up to 4.6%. And I think at this point, we're likely going to see it hit 5% before too long. And if the 10-year yield keeps going up, I think it will continue to be a drag on risk assets, right? The 10-year yield, in fact, right, it actually was getting a pretty nice drop, but you can see that it ended up bottoming out right here on this trend line, and then it bounced back up. And so I think the argument is that if stocks are back near their all-time highs, and if Bitcoin has already put in a new all-time high, then why can't the long end of the yield curve continue to go back up? Remember, the long end of the yield curve will only really durably go down if we get a larger recession, right? But if risk assets are just screaming higher, then that's not really suggestive of that. And so if risk assets are doing okay, then there's a good chance the long end of the yield curve will continue, to generally trend higher. The other thing that, could weigh on Bitcoin is the S&P 500, right? Like the S&P has not put in a new all-time high yet. It doesn't mean it won't, but it hasn't yet. And the S&P, I kind of expect some weakness in the third quarter as well. So I think in the short term, when you look at days like today and you see Bitcoin at new cycle highs, it's just sort of this like affirmation of why we spend so much time talking about Bitcoin dominance and how do you get exposure to the upside? How do you minimize your downside risk? Just because we talk about Bitcoin dominance, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go down, right? It's gone down plenty of times, right? It's gone down plenty of times. It just means that if Bitcoin's going down, most everything else is probably going down more, right? And so that's kind of the still the argument I would argue is that, Bitcoin will likely continue to outperform most everything else. And if you look closely at 2023 and 2024 in these consolidation phases where, in 2023, Bitcoin did put a new all-time highs, new cycle highs. But during those periods, Bitcoin dominance was going up. Okay? Bitcoin dominance was going up, even though Bitcoin USD wasn't really making a major move in either direction. Bitcoin was going up. Bitcoin dominance was going up in those cases. So I'm going to continue to stick with that story. It's done a pretty good job so far. If Bitcoin breaks out and goes to even higher prices, maybe if it can break out above 110K, then I would guess you're going to see dominance continue to go higher. If it plays out like, say, 2023 or 2024, where it just kind of fades back down into the third quarter of the year, and then we try again in Q4, then you're still likely going to see Bitcoin dominance go higher. So I would still argue that Bitcoin does give you exposure to the upside while minimizing the downside risk, right? But anyways, again, any day that Bitcoin puts in a new all-time high, I think is cause for celebration. We are going to have a golden cross in a couple of days. I'm not going to act deterministically about it, but just know that more often than not, there are 10 to 15% drops at the very least after golden crosses, which sounds crazy, right? Sounds really bad, but then you realize that a 10% drop just gets Bitcoin to where it was 2 weeks ago, even a 15% drop, right, would just get Bitcoin back to where it was still about 2 weeks ago, like just earlier this month. So it doesn't really seem like that crazy of an idea. And if it were to get that drop, I think you would actually get a nice bounce off of it and maybe even see Bitcoin come back up and try to break out again. And hopefully it'll be successful. If it's not successful, if Bitcoin's not able to break out durably after like 4 weeks, if it's just kind of doing what it did in 2023, then it might be time to prepare for sort of weakness in the third quarter. But that's still a little ways off. Anyways, those are my views right now in the market. Bitcoin did put in an all-time high. Let's celebrate that, and we'll see if the drop after the death cross actually materializes or not. If it does, then we'll talk about how to navigate that. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.